So welcome to an evening with Julian Carr. Julian Carr is a member of the Yorko Gauge Group and has been building dioramas to display rolling stock and vehicles since 2012. And in Julian's words, a diorama is a window into a lost world of infrastructure. And he's going to talk through the creation of his own dioramas that depict scenes typical of those serving the Greenwich Peninsula within the Greater London boundary, down into North Kent, and they're collectively known as of London clay. And Julian does take these out to exhibitions and display them as well to show people what is possible within dioramas. All the locations are fictional, merely seeking to represent the style and type of transport and infrastructure used by the local industry, the population in the Lower Thames Valley, and in the immediate post-war period, so 1945 to 1952. The individual scenes are designed to capture something of the memories of generations that lived in those eras and worked in the area in the period being modelled, be it how industry was served by road or rail transport in the days before pallets, forklifts or mass containerisation, and where people went shopping prior to the advent of the supermarket or the retail park, or even the washing, how the washing was done in the period preceding automatic washing dryers. So we've got some scenes of history and showing people what things were like in different periods. All the models are a combination of readily available proprietary kits, scratch building or 3D prints with scratch built editions, or off-the-shelf die-cast products suitably altered to fit the period. And Julian's going to be able to tell us about his dioramas, but then introduce us to the process for creating them. So welcome, Julian, and thank you very much for being on this evening. I know you were nominated by Richard Mills as a fellow Yorko Gauge Group member, so thank you very much for joining us.
No problem at all. Thank you, Jackie. Anytime you want to get the slide deck up, we'll make a start.
Yep. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so everybody should be seeing the first slide now, which mirrors the art.
Okay, excellent. Well, that's just our first slide, which basically tells you where we're going to go and what we're going to do and what we're about, of London clay. Next slide, please, Jackie. A tour of pictorial scenes illustrating the bygone world of infrastructure and everyday life, otherwise known as of London clay. Next slide, please, Jackie. Right then. We start by stepping off a number 38 at the Gaumont. This section here is a double track section of conduit just south of the Thames, where routes 16 and 3638 might cross. Unusually for the capital city, we find a loading island to our right, giving passengers somewhere to disembark in comparative safety from other road users, whilst to our left we see a pawnbroker's and an abandoned bookshop. Zachariah's Pawnbrokers is closed today and shuttered against trade. Maybe it's half-day closing, or maybe there just isn't a trade around to open 6 days a week at the moment. Brown's bookshop next door has been abandoned, clearly for some time, and the premises has been boarded up to keep out any squatters. It seems, though, there are rooms to let above the shop. You'd like to think that they'd be cheap. The outer wall of the bookshop is held up by a raking shore, the internal room decorations still being clearly visible, now open to the elements. Advertising hoardings fill the bomb gap between the shop and the Gaumont cinema. Bomb sites are still plentiful in the capital. I'm sure it won't be the last we see today. The scars inflicted by the recent conflict will surely take many years to heal yet. It's still too early for Mother Nature to have started her reclamation work, and a fair number of these plots are screened off by advertising hoardings, this being no exception. The current poster on the main billboard is for grey cigarettes, and that reminds me, I must pick up a packet of 10 or a couple of loose when we see a newsagent somewhere, just to keep me going until lunchtime. There's a bit of fly posting around here with adverts for the boxing, the dogs, and the speedway racing on the fencing here, all of which is picking up again after the war. People like to get out and about and do some things. It's coming back now. It's often foggy down here by the river, and street lighting is a mix of electric and gas, both of which should add an eerie localized glow, and the gas in particular a suitable odour to the regular pea supers, as the fogs are known in this area. Next slide, please, Jackie. Some of the tram's crew share a chat with an inspector out on the loading island, whilst both of the trams wait their times for departure from this route interchange. There's a complete absence of other passengers. Maybe they're all at work today. The cinema is also quiet, the lull before the early evening storm as the punters pour in to catch the latest from Ealing Studios, or to try and catch a glimpse of a relative or loved one still in service overseas in the regular Pathé news bulletins, which is where most of us get our news if we haven't picked up a paper yet today. Something called Kind Hearts and Coronets is billed as coming soon, whilst Passport to Pimlico, starring Stanley Holloway and Margaret Rutherford, and Charles Hawtrey, is on current release. Having seen it last week, I thoroughly recommend it. Very good. Captured the spirit under rationing very well, I thought. Will the Burgundians get to keep their rations? Well, we'll see, won't we? The prices at what is now the Odeon seem reasonable for the Saturday morning cowboy flicks. Maybe I'll head over this way again soon and catch a Western. They seem to be all of the rage just currently. The telephone box outside the cinema is one of those giant K2 types in dress colours, more akin to the West End than around here perhaps. And there's a post box there for company, which points the way to the local post office, which is really useful when you need one. The pair defend the crossing directly outside the cinema doors and are probably quite useful as crowd control, particularly when the late evening showings spill out onto the road looking for a tram home. No time for us to hang about here and catch the lunchtime showing today, however. We'll push on south over the crossing. There's still lots to see. Next slide, please, Jackie. A short stroll brings us to an industrial ironmonger's in the ownership of Huggins, Bayliss and Jones. These new in inverted commas, factory offices were built within the skeleton of one of the old tramway buildings from the early days of the horse-drawn trams, the outline of which can be seen in the remnants of the front and back wall. The windowsills are still there, but the windows and the rest of the front wall have gone long ago. The first electric cars would have worked from here too. And then the gauge was widened out to 4 foot 8.5 to take bigger trams and marry in with the local railway network. And you can still see remnants of the old and relocated tramway overhead adjacent to the main gate. Security here has to be tight, as fuel for the road transport fleet has been provided, both petrol and heavy oil, gas oil to the Yanks and diesel to us, to cover all of the different types of wagon that HBJ will be using. They have a sizable fleet. Key customers such as London Transport also have arrangements with HBJ for fuel provision and storage for maintenance vehicles. So it's not unusual to see a tower wagon or other LT vehicles waiting for a fill or collecting materials for repair of the main tramway network outside the main gate. This is still quite extensive, even though they're taking the trams off steadily now. Trolley buses too in some areas. It looks like the diesel bus will be the mainstay for the London Transport fleet before very long. Fuel dispensing is rather rudimentary. Spillage must be kept to a minimum, and security must be kept tight as fuel is still rationed for the everyday motorists, few that there are. Industry must continue to function, however, and rationing must end soon, surely, though when, we're not quite sure yet. Next slide, please, Jackie. The new office block still shows blackout provisions from the war, and the covered loading bay features a capstan for bringing rail wagons in should there be no shunter available. The siding to the front edge of the yard is wired to suit trams, and occasionally you can see a small electric shunter work in the yard, which must be DC though, 450 to 500 volts, same as the LCC trams are. These capstans are probably the electric variety as well, but today we can see the front end of a diesel shunter, a Fowler I think by the look of it, so no need for shunting by rope today. The foreman's bike leans against the canopy pillar, Maybe he's off for lunch in a while and just doing the rounds to check on stocks of some fitting or other before he sets off home. The yard might be seen to contain all the necessary bits and bobs for maintaining the public transport network, as it doubles up as some form of permanent way yard. Things like new traction poles, bracket arms, wiring stocks, insulators, rails, and even granite sets, along with a tar boiler to bed them in place. But today there's not much in, it's relatively quiet, not much about. Unlike the coal yard across the way, where we're off to now. Next slide, please, Jackie. Just opposite Huggins, Bayliss and Jones is a coal merchant's yard complete with a railway siding, now in the hands of William Carr and Sons, with maybe a tenant coalman in residence. Somebody called Pierce by the look of it, I think. It's been through several owners since I've known it. I remember old man Willoughby running it, several horse and carts he had for deliveries all around this area. In the distant past, this was originally a small farm complex. The yard has developed over the years as the railway has arrived to be the primary supply point for coal in the immediate vicinity. The old farmhouse was converted to a domestic residence for the resident coalman, with a stall riser cum bay window where the farm produce and subsequently coal was sold from. One of the smaller barns remains, now converted to a paraffin and oil store, and the stable block might still be in use for a couple of horses for local deliveries along with storage of fodder. Mains water was quite late into this district, and a lot of houses around here still being off the communal pump. The horse trough next to the yard office gets a regular top-up from the rainwater goods on the stable, and many a coalman has taken a quick wash here before his lunch or his snap. We can see how coal wagons are shunted into the siding full, unloaded by hand directly onto waiting road vehicles or into the bins at the far end of the yard, where the coal can be weighed and bagged. Demurrage on the wagons needs to be avoided wherever possible. Different customers will require different types of coal. Nuts or beans are popular for the hearth or cooking, whereas some may require the larger cobbles or anthracite for industry perhaps. Smokeless fuels are coming in, such as colite, and that can be obtained by order from the yard office, which also contains the weighing equipment linked to the weighbridge adjacent that sits in the gateway to the yard. Next slide, please, Jackie. Not a great deal is kept in stock here, the coal merchant preferring to order in and deliver out immediately rather than risk theft of such a valuable commodity by it being left laid about. Perhaps there's more coal in the stables than there is fodder for the horses. The yard is tight. It's designed for horse-drawn traffic, and there's little room for manoeuvre now that loads are getting bigger and are mostly moved by internal combustion engine, although the horse is still very common around here, particularly for local deliveries. A local merchant, Cuny's Coal of Woolwich, is loading up for a delivery round, direct from a wagon, weighed into 100-weight sacks and stacked in order on the lorry according to his planned delivery route. The lorry itself is a pre-war Bedford and may not serve for too much longer. Cuny's perhaps eyeing up a D-Mob Bedford O-type, or an Austin of a similar size, which you might get cheap at one of the many dispersal sales that are cropping up now that the war is behind us. There are remnants of the blackout all around. Note the tarpaulin over the roof light on the stable block, which has started to slip over the last couple of years. The yard lighting here is rudimentary at best, downright insufficient and dangerous at worst. Despite regular sweeping, the cobbled yard has a slippery black sheen on it, and everyone working here is black bright all day long. With the ever-present coal dust, the smoke from the surrounding chimneys and the regular pea super fogs, it'll be a rare day indeed when the sunlight manages to penetrate into this yard from behind Draper's butchery next door. The smell from the abattoir is beginning to catch on the back of my throat. Time to press on, I think. Next slide, Jackie, please. As we come back out onto the high road, a 4-axle heavy with drag passes us by. This one belongs to Pease and Sons, who run for Tate and Lyle, sugar people, out of their Silvertown works over the water, amongst others, mainly with bag sugar going out when Tate's fleet is overly busy. As we can read on the wagon side raves, Pease and Sons are wharfingers, based on Wandle Wharf over in Wandsworth. Some mouthful that. Still, you won't need to remember all of that. Just telephone Putney 2420 and tell them what you need. I'm sure they'll oblige quick sharp with some form of transport. These paint their wagons in an attractive livery of red chassis with brown bodywork. This is clearly number 5, but a replacement number 5, as these guys have been around for a while now, starting with horse and carts, moving through steam wagons and into oilers as soon as practically possible. Depending on what's needed to be moved today, they might drop the trailer and leave it for loading later, if they can arrange that down at the factory, especially if they've dropped one previously, which is now standing full and ready to go. 2-man crew by regulation, the second man being for trailer braking and much needed help with the loading and unloading when they get where they're going. If they're lucky, it'll only be 1 load today, but if it's a local drop, it might mean 2, and that could be around 60 tons, all by hand, and all sheeted against the weather, just in case it rains. Next slide, please, Jackie. This area is riddled with branch lines feeding industry and into various dockside riverside outlets. A short stroll up the high road brings us into contact with one such line. 2 main feeder lines begin to branch out here to serve industrial premises to either side. A pedestrian footbridge spans the rails at the up end of the yard, feeding down onto the dock road adjacent. The remnant of a bombed-out factory premises is immediately visible to us, complete with wharfage facilities, as advertised for sale by the Royal Arsenal Cooperative Society on the board over the gateway into the site. Ballast down this particular branch is more ash than stone, and all of the turnouts are hand-thrown by the train crews, usually when shunting. Maintenance is at a minimum, though rail traffic levels, of course, are still high. Quiet today, nothing visible inside is to be seen. The footbridge leads up and over the branch, between the factories, and eventually down to a set of waterman's stairs leading out into the river. At one time, these stairs were quite common, but a lot have been swallowed up into yards and factories now, or been smashed up to make way for deeper wharfage for the larger ships. A lot of this sort of thing went during the preparations for the war, and then, of course, the Luftwaffe remodelled it all for us once again. If you know where to look, you can still find a few of these stairways, though, and you might just find someone fishing on them. It's quite a common pastime. A postbox can just be seen tucked into the area behind the footbridge stairs, where there is also a modern K6 telephone box, A and B type mechanism. This gets a lot of use by lorry drivers in either direction, into or out of the docks, for instructions on where to go to pick up the next load. So it's not unusual to see a variety of lorries parked up here waiting instructions on their next job. Today in Atkinson from BRS, British Road Services, is in residence, and the driver is probably on the phone, or perhaps he's having a tea opposite. Next slide, please, Jackie. I'll bet that's our driver there, the bloke with the red hair. He'll be Irish, I bet. They all seem to be Irish on the demolition round here. Peeing maybe a bun from the van for the hundreds of lorry drivers and van drivers that pass this bomb site every single day. The forerunner of the Transport Cafe, the Albion is demobbed from NAFI service and now serves the local population tea and whatever can be gleaned from surrounding suppliers as rationing finally begins to ebb away. This is vital sustenance in the day for a workforce familiar with powdered egg, tinned food and dried fruit. That Albion there will have a petrol engine. I wonder where he's getting it. It's still rationed for most of us. Next slide, please, Jackie. The remnants of the houses that occupied these plots can be seen in what is left of the outhouses formerly to the rear of the properties. The site has been tidied as best as it could be at the time. Further development may yet be years away. So the owner of the Albion has taken the opportunity to use the plot as a prime retail site. And why not, quite frankly? The internal decorations of number 93 now stand naked against the elements for all to see, fading into grey-black obscurity as the weather does its work. Some of the fireplaces remain, others dropped out in the blast and during the make-safe demolition. It looks as if one of the WCs is still complete, and it's possibly functioning, a useful water supply for the van and its clients, perhaps. Across the old back lane, the railway arches in the background shelter many businesses, some of which are advertised on the end wall of number 103, which, judging by the mail shoved under the front door, has been empty for some time now, the previous occupants having relocated to a slightly more upmarket area, perhaps Silvertown over the water by the look of it. If it is Silvertown, I'm not so sure about the upmarket element, but never know. Next slide, please, Jackie. Various costermongers' barrows are stored around the rear of the property at the end of Athenaeum Row, waiting the next mad scramble to get the finest groceries up to the local markets. Stevenson, the grocer, bides his time with a tea, 2, 3, maybe 4 sugars if they've managed to get any. Maybe blag some off one of the peas drivers going by. They got a bag refined sugar on. Waiting for the delivery into Fox the wholesaler, having returned this week's empty crates. I wonder, what will today's fresh special off the boats be? Bananas? Fresh oranges? Maybe even peaches that aren't in tins. Watch out for them big spiders. Give you a nasty bite, they will. Next slide, please, Jackie. Turning into Burma Road, we encounter a rail-served oil depot, fed off the dock branch. This might be where the source of the fuel is for our man in the T-van. He won't use a lot of his ration if he's a local. The facility is owned and operated by National Benzole, although the name is painted out on the yard gates for wartime security. Since the war, someone has put up an enamel sign to mark ownership on the wall next to the gate, and with a livery of yellow, it's very difficult to miss these vehicles. Now, the story of National Benzole is actually quite interesting. The company itself was founded in 1919 in a room next to the boiler house of the Gas, Light and Coke Company over on Horseferry Road. In the early years of the century, Benzole production was just small scale. But it turns out, because it was just as good at propelling shells as it was powering motor vehicles, production was expanded massively during the First World War. And this led to something of a post-war Benzole Lake. Now, a group of very smart men, including Samuel Henshaw, the then chairman of the Staffordshire Chemical Company, reckoned there was money in this. And so Henshaw became the first chairman of National Benzole. Although the idea of using benzole to power vehicles wasn't new, anything fueled on neat benzole ended up needing to change carburettor settings, which was downright inconvenient for anyone who had a vehicle who used neat petrol normally. The effectiveness of neat benzole as a paint stripper also gave rise to concern about the possible effect on carburettor floats made of varnished cork, which there were back then in a lot of early vehicles, particularly in American vehicles that were coming over a lot and in great numbers at the time, particularly as First World War surplus. So there was a concern about the quality of this benzole and the specification of the fuel that was being provided. So looking at the consistency of fuel quality, Henshaw and his colleagues recognised their commercial opportunity, and they set up a distribution network consisting of just a few storage depots around the country, worked and supplied by a small fleet of well-used lorries, First World War lorries with solid tyres, all from war disposals. And these carried the fuel in war surplus drums in cans of 2, 4 or 50 gallons. Now, problems came up in 1920 from a coal strike. Why? That restricted the benzole availability and increased demand. The frequent shortages of coal shale, from which benzole is actually made, led to this sort of ebb and flow of demand. At the same time, the problems with it stripping paint and making a mess out of carburettors, people started to mix it with normal petrol on a 50-50 mixture. And so these lads cottoned onto this and thought, okay, well, if we mix it ourselves and start to sell it, we're onto a good thing here. You could still buy neat benzole when they were doing the 50-50 mixture, but a lot of people used to use it as an anti-knocking performance come enhancing additive, which seems a bit strange, really, when you consider what it was doing to your average petrol engine at the time. Now, this all coincided with military service in the First World War, teaching British men and introducing British men to motoring for the first time. So returning survivors from the war began where funds permitted to get small motor cars or small motorbikes particularly popular, while others set up businesses to maintain these small motor cars and repair some of the wealthy patrons' vehicles that were coming back out of storage after the First World War. Before the war, Second War, motor fuel suppliers in the UK had typically been pharmacies, cycle shops, or even blacksmiths. But after the war, commercial roadside garages began to appear, albeit slowly at first. Now, because they were so sparse, the AA, the Automobile Association, set up 12 strategically located filling stations, supplying fuel only to its own members, but making no profit from the sales. Initially, because the AA fuel station supplied only national Benzole, which was seen as a particularly patriotic fuel choice, because the coal shale was the principal ingredient from which Benzole was domestically produced. In 1927, the AA dismantled its small chain of service stations as the growth of commercially motivated network rendered them unnecessary. But by this time, of course, national Benzole was established all over the place. And during this period, the company conspicuously smartened up its public face. Next slide, please, Jackie. An imaginative advertising campaign was developed. And in 1928, Mr. Mercury, surprisingly naked, leapt for the first time from the pages of our national newspapers. Now, Mr. Mercury, in national Benzole's black and chrome gold corporate colours, went on to become one of the most powerful marketing images of that age. And by 1937, the head office had moved out from the shadow of the Gaslight and Coal Company and had gone to an upmarket location in London's Grosvenor Gardens. And they recruited a sales force and equipped them with Morris Cowleys, all painted in yellow, which had by now become the company's colour. And the 50-50 blend, of course, by now was absolutely everywhere. Almost every service station in the 1930s had a national Benzole pump. Eventually, the naked Mr. Mercury was relegated down to just his head, and that became the brand's logo. And of course, at the outbreak of the Second World War, all petrol brands were pooled, giving way to pooled petrol. And by 1942, fuel was only available to official users, such as the emergency services, bus companies, farmers, and the armed forces. But it was still quite difficult to get. Anyway, seen here are 3 railside standposts for offloading top discharge rail cars, Type A, with the filling shed and the road wagon loading bay beyond. There are 2 separate tanks in the yard for different types of oil, with filling posts attendant and a simple pump arrangement for filling road delivery vehicles. The yard WC acts as a water supply point and also as a fire point, where all the buckets of sand are collected and refilled after they've magically migrated around the yard for use in mopping up spillages. The buffer stop on the siding is a substantial concrete affair designed to stop rail cars overrunning the siding and crashing into the boiler house beyond. Yet another example, really, of the cheek by jowl nature of differing industries on the road down to the docks, and perhaps illustrating the previous use of the yard. Rail cars are usually worked in by capstan, once again, having been dropped off outside the private siding gate. But occasionally a fireless loco is borrowed from a factory across the way, should there be a lot of shunting to be done. After all, the oil rail cars are in constant demand these days, and demurrage is once again to be avoided wherever possible, particularly when deliveries are made in other owners' rail cars. Next slide, please, Jackie. Well, whilst we're here, I look into the rear yard at British Ropes Factory, previously Craddock's Wire Ropes. And this finds 2 of the yardmen chatting with a local law enforcement. The tractor driver leans against his trusty steed, which is a Fordson shunting tractor that looks to be on loan from London Transport. Behind the yardman, leaning on his broom, is a full trailer that looks to be on, looks like overhead span wire, I think, waiting collection. It's probably going over to Huggins, Bailey's and Jones yard that we looked at earlier. It looks to be one of their trailers. The yard gateway is tight for the bigger wagons that are in use today, having once again been built for horse and cart traffic. So the tractor driver will likely take the drivers up to the main gate past the boiler house so it can be picked up with ease. Extensions to the factory buildings to cope with war production demands, have overstretched the arch gateway lettered E, later number 5. And this, coupled with the increase in size and weight of the more modern road traffic, has led to the permanent closure of Gateway 5 into the factory complex itself. The rear yard is still accessible. Indeed, the original iron gates have been renewed with a mechanised sliding gate arrangement. But most road traffic now uses the main gate further up the road. Directions are posted on the base of the main chimney, so any delivery drivers who can't see anyone can see it prior to turning into the narrow lane that leads to the old gateway. And then, of course, you'd have a tricky reversing manoeuvre back out onto the main road. It's a good job there's a second man on trailer deliveries. Next slide, please, Jackie. George Riley, or his descendants at number 11, still have road access to their outbuilding store at the rear and have taken to leaving their delivery tanker parked up outside the old gateway. The business is a survivor, really, perhaps from before the original factory development even. Those jars on the shop pediment denote a dealer in oils for the illiterate. The remnants of the advertising boards and painted adverts adorning the rest of the building, informing the local population what Messrs. Riley trade in. Charles and Row on the left, next door, dates from 1858, and there are 3 dwellings in the row, none of which will get a great deal of natural sunlight. Number 10 at the far end is home to a sweep, as advertised by the illuminating symbol by his door. Not uncommon for these to be lodging houses for railway workers or factory workers, maybe 3, 4, even 5 beds to a room, sometimes sharing a bed, which would be in almost constant use. Many an off-duty railwayman will tell you a tale about climbing into a bed and finding it still warm from its previous occupant. Not uncommon at all. There's not enough housing to go around, really. The bulk of the factory looms behind, casting its shadow while the main factory chimney decorates the entire area with soot on a 24-hour basis. Little opportunity for a decent whitewash in these rear courts and yards, despite what the billboard adverts tell us. It might wash right enough, but drying it out on the line in these rear yards might result in it being black bright again by the time it's dry. Next slide, please, Jackie. Well, a bit further on, we come to a rail-served cobbled yard fronting a bonding stores and general goods warehouse. Now, a bonded warehouse, and you'll have seen the term about no doubt, is a secure warehouse in which goods are stored until customs duty is paid or the goods are cleared for export. Now, bonded warehouses began in Britain in 1803 with the adoption of a system first proposed by Prime Minister Robert Walpole some 70 years before, back in 1733, as early as that. Before that, duties were due on goods as soon as they came into the country. Now, with a bonded warehouse, a business can import goods to a customs bonded warehouse across the world, anywhere in the world, and store it there until further notice without paying any duty fees immediately. So there's a major advantage there. The warehouse dates from the days of shunting by hand and by horse, supplemented and ultimately superseded by the use of hydraulic capstans. In this yard, these capstans are driven using power provided by the accumulator in the tower to the left-hand end of the yard. The capstans are operated using the foot treadles at each individual capstan location, and there's a bit of skill and dexterity needed with a rope to drag individual wagons or coupled sets into and out of the yard. You can see that the goods list serving bay number 1 is designed to facilitate top-loading vans favoured by the pre-grouping companies and give dry loading or unloading for wagons parked external to the main warehouse. Being set up for an early loading gauge, the inset track is to a tight radius, and it's laid in dock rail, which gives an automatic check rail function. But being flush paved, if anything does come back or come off, you can always tow it back on using one of the captains. It's tricky, but it can be done. 2 wagon turntables are featured here, and it's relatively easy to understand how a full train might be dealt with quickly and efficiently too, working loaded wagons in and empty wagons out of the warehouse. No one has taken the air raid precautions from the warehouse windows, and it appears the yard has escaped the worst effects of the Blitz. The woodwork retains its pre-war paintwork, but it's in need of some attention to prolong its life, as does the canopy drainage. As goods handling has changed over the years, so has the configuration of the loading mechanisms within the yard. A loading dock with a canopy for weather protection and fully enclosed goods hoists have been added to service the later design of side door loading rail wagons. And being fully paved, the loading dock can serve rail, road, horse-drawn vehicles, whatever it needs to. It's set low enough to be able to accommodate anything, as well as the possibility of direct loading or unloading directly into rail vans from the main yard itself. Yards like this are usually where you'll find those mechanical horses from Scammell and others, but mostly Scammell. They're really good. They can turn on a sixpence and swap trailers in under a minute. A brilliant invention for getting goods in and out of these tight spaces, as horse traffic ultimately declines and becomes more and more unfashionable. Next slide, please, Jackie. Soon we cross the main railway line down into the docks. Now, this area was bombed heavily during the war, and a street shelter was provided for the local working population. Access to the shelter, if the gates were shut against the road, is over the footbridge, which has clearly been recycled from somewhere else on the region, judging by the new foundation works and lack of symmetry over the running lines. I'm not entirely sure what the regional civil engineer would say. Needs must, probably. The original wicket gates have been removed when the bridge was installed, and pedestrians were now forced up and over the bridge for their own safety during a rain. Now the war is behind us, the shelter lies abandoned, and an attempt has been made to keep the kids and the vagrants out at least. Road competition for freight movement is rapidly building up, and it's easy to imagine the frustration of a driver of a heavily loaded four-axle wagon struggling to maintain his momentum at his allowed maximum speed of 20 miles an hour, wrestling with a rudimentary 3-speed gearbox to come to a stop as the signalman closes the gates against him to allow yet another seemingly endless train of vans or coal trudge past. Today, however, it's bright and clear, and drivers can get a clear run at the crossing. For the signalman, there's time between trains for a chat with a length man over a cup of tea. And what's the subject here, I wonder? A reported rough ride on the down main at milepost 16 3/4? Nationalisation, perhaps? The ration? Last night's radio show? Yesterday's cricket? Who knows? The thought of that tea and bun earlier has just made me hungry. Time to see about some lunch, I think. Next slide, please, Jackie. Passing beyond Chaplin & Co.'s manufacturing, we encounter the start of a row of prefabs. As the war progressed, it became obvious to the government at the time that there would be an acute housing shortage when peace finally did come. In order to address the situation, the Conservatives under Churchill proposed to build for an anticipated 200,000 shortfall in post-war housing stock. And they were going to do that by building 500,000 prefabricated houses with a life of 10 years. And they were going to do all of that within 5 years of the end of the war. Well, best laid plans and all of that. The eventual Bill of State law under the post-war Labour government of Prime Minister Clement Attlee only actually agreed to deliver 300,000 units. But within a 10-year period, still with a decent budget, though, of 150 million. Now, that's an awful lot of money in 1952. Through the use of wartime production facilities and creation of common standards developed by the fabled Ministry of Works, the programme actually got off to a good start. But in the end, it foundered through a combination of commercial rivalry, public concern, and pure cost. In the end, prefabs were more expensive to build than conventional houses. The expected excess of materials, which was a prime factor in the design ethos, was actually taken up at a quicker rate through Britain's post-war export drive to reduce our burgeoning war debts. And in the end, of the 1.2 million new houses built from 1945 to last year, 1951, when the programme actually finished, officially ended, that is, it's thought that only around 156,000 prefabs were actually constructed. It looks like this is where the local butcher lives. Maybe he's home for lunch or something. Note the Anderson shelter in the garden and the mangle outside the shelter entrance. From the deck chair in the garden, it doesn't look like there's been much washing done this morning so far, and there's certainly nothing drying on the line. These plots are subdivided with a combination of chestnut payoff fencing, which has sprung up all over the place since the war, marking out the bomb sites, and a mesh type fence called chain link, I believe. Next slide, please, Jackie. Let's have a closer look. There are 13 types of these prefab from 11 different manufacturers, including one from the USA. Although they're all based around the same concept, each manufacturer had their own detailed design and decided on which materials they would use. And these materials were chosen from concrete, asbestos cement, steel, wood, and aluminium, or a combination of all, as decided by each manufacturer. Now, attitudes to prefabs vary tremendously. For some people who managed to survive the bombing, they were thought of as being ugly and somewhat out of place. But for others, of course, who'd lost their homes and were living in trying circumstances, they were delighted at last to have their own space to live in. And returning servicemen who needed somewhere to start a family were extremely grateful to be gifted one of these. For some, these prefabs were far superior to the slums they were bombed out on. It's estimated that back in 1945, a quarter of homes in the capital were without mains electricity. And only last year, 1951, a third of homes did not have a plumbed-in bath. Few can afford a fridge, and some use their ovens with a block of ice if they can get it to try and keep food fresh. Very few fridges around. So when you look at it, prefabs offered a good standard of accommodation, albeit in an unconventional or maybe perhaps unfamiliar format. And I think that's probably the problem here. Nobody likes anything too new. Looking at this one, I think the gate's been recycled from an earlier property, and the pram also seems to be from a somewhat earlier time. It's clear the kids have been busy playing hopscotch, and no doubt they'll be after that pram for the wheels when its current occupant is done with it. Next slide, please, Jackie. Now we're up at the junction. Chance to get my fags and a paper to read over lunch. We'll just squeeze past mother and daughter who are inspecting the fruit available from Stevenson's. Looks like one of the boys serving out front, perhaps debating how far half a pound of gooseberries might go with mother and just how much of the weekly budget it will cost them. I wonder when the old man will get back from the wholesalers. He must have finished his tea by now. Probably just stood having a crack. No signs of any imminent business for Stenton Lintorn the butchers. But then again, we've seen his van parked up at the back of the prefab, haven't we? Or any activity up at the barbers. Everything is quiet. The old printer's standing empty. Waiting a new business opportunity, perhaps. Southern Electric provide a regular service up to town, or further down to the suburbs should it be required. The signal stands sentinel for up rail traffic. It's likely you need a good head for heights if you want to get into the rear of the lamp case on that signal. The drop to the street's about 40 feet. Then again, you might get a soft landing if there's any grit in the LCC grip bin. Looks like Brill Cream is all the rage. Dennis Compton, no less, famous Middlesex and England cricketer and Arsenal footballer, keeps you right on top. No need for an appointment at the barber's when it's this quiet. Just stroll in for a hot shave and a wash and brush up. Big leather chair. Remember, with a plank across for the arms for the kids. Cutthroat razor sharpened on a leather strop, and an ex-military man with a steel comb dishing out the short back and sides. Always a steamy atmosphere in here. That smell of leather and alcohol from that spiced cologne. Next slide, please, Jackie. We could get some lunch up here. What do you fancy? Fresh fruit, maybe? Something more substantial from the cafe next door? I see the grocer's getting a drop-off from BRS Parcels. And that's the older brother there taking delivery of some package or other. A local moggie's clearly trying his luck around the grocer's legs. Looks well fed. Must be relatively good hunting around these parts. What with a butcher, a cafe and a grocer's. Plenty of mice and rats to be had, no doubt. You see plenty of these BRS, British Road Services vehicles about these days. Created from the British Transport Commission as a result of the Transport Act of 1947 under Attlee, under the name of British Road Services, the British Road Haulage Network was nationalised, along with the railways, canals and docks. At least anyone carried 40 miles or more. Some 246 road haulage firms, again, along with all of the railways, canals and docks, were nationalised, and that is some undertaking. It's reckoned there's around 700,000 people employed by the British Transport Commission or its sister companies. That's absolutely massive. All of the vehicles wear different liveries. These parcels vans are green, general road haulage is red, and Pickfords, who do heavy haulage and removals and the like, are dark blue. And so are the vans that they use for meat traffic. There's a huge trade in that off the docks. I believe animal traffic is handled by brown vehicles, according to my my little ABC spotters guide. But I suppose you can't paint everything overnight. I've seen plenty of red cattle wagons around before now. Next slide, please, Jackie. Right, I'm off in here for me fags and a paper. Just nip in a cafe next door and grab a table if you can. Order me a pie and peas, would you please? And I'll be there in a jiffy. After lunch, we get a train back. Or we could take the train up to town maybe for the afternoon. Do a bit of nosing around the Kingsway subway or a bit of spotting around Nine Elms, maybe, if we can get in. Anyway, we'll sort that out in a bit. Pie and peas, mind. Not fussed on the spuds. There'll be plenty of them in the pie, no doubt. I'll see you in a bit. Finny. And there, ladies and gentlemen, we leave it for now. I hope that stirred up a few memories for you and that you've enjoyed our tour of London Play.
Julian, thank you so much. I know that's just the tour of your dioramas and the story that goes with them, and we'll come on to the building side. But I just can't believe how authentic you've made them and the story that goes with them. I'd like to just ask one question to start us off, please. And do you start with the model and put the story to it, or do you have the story and the history and build a model to show it?
Good question. Combination of both, and it really depends what's available out there on the market immediately or how much work I've got to do to create the story. And it's very flexible, really, Jackie, in what I do and how I do it. And I'll demonstrate a bit of that as we go into the next section. But there are some wonderful things on the market in 1/43rd. I work in other scales as well, and am drawn to this time frame, to this period. I suppose because that's somewhat easier than trying to do the most immediate period that people might remember at this time, which is sort of 60s, late 60s into early 70s. That's actually quite a difficult market to populate with correct pattern vehicles. But there is quite a lot available for earlier, and you can always do a bit of scratch building. And because all of the locations are fictional, you can mix and match. So it allows you to create anything you want to do, really. You know, there's not much to it. You just build what you enjoy, really. And then you can weave it any story you like around it. But we'll touch on that a bit further as we get on.
There's a couple of comments cropping up. Tony Geary said he can remember the prefabs and the chain link fences, and Dave Robinson saying the chain link fences were great to climb over. You needed to be careful getting your feet into the gaps.
All right when you're small, or if you've got winkle pickers on, but that comes from a slightly later period, doesn't it?
Yeah, and Michael just telling us that that was absolutely brilliant, and there's a great book in that. Loved the benzene bit and the AA, and funny he should say there's a great book in that, but we have talked about getting some of this published in the Gazette and doing some pictures and some story about each of the dioramas, because it's a wonderful thing to tell.
Well, yes, agreed. And the dioramas lend themselves to any vehicle at any time, and mix and matching, as again we'll describe further on, and I've tried to keep the front end of the presentation there to relatively simple shots to show the diorama. When they're out on exhibition, of course, they're populated with vehicles which you can change throughout the course of a day, so you can alter the perspective or people's perspective when they view the things. They don't get out much. The pandemic sort of put paid to the initial start of showing them, but they've been out a couple of times, and I'm sort of limited at the moment by the number I can move in a vehicle at any given one time, because of the size of the things when they're boxed up. But again, we'll come on to that in the next section.
Okay. And there's one comment here. I notice elements of George Liffey Stokes in your models. Was he an inspiration?
Inspirations, well, yes, undoubtedly. There's been some fantastic modelers over the years, and you'll notice what I'm doing here is more about the interface really between traditional railway modeling, and the wider world. And this is pre-pallet or pre-palletization or pre-ISO container. This series of events and dioramas is really based around human interface, the work involved. If you think about that 4-axle wagon loaded, you get 30 ton on there, and that's all loaded by hand in bloody great 100-weight sacks. So the inspiration comes from all over the place, really, and I suppose a nod to all of those generations that had it so tough coming out the back end of the Second World War, really.
That's excellent, thank you. Any other questions from anybody before we move on?
Just one. Just a comment, Jackie. Following on from the 30 ton of sacks on the wagon, they were, of course, needed sheeting down and secured with ropes. And that's a skill that's gone.
Yes, rope and sheet. Yes, there'll be a wagon coming up at some stage in the future that features proper dollies on the ropes that tensions the tarpaulin down. We'll see that in a while. I left it off the dioramas from earlier on because it was blocking the view of something, which is always when you do this and you put these things out on a show, deciding what to put out front and what you want to display, you have to sort of pick it because it hides what's going on behind, particularly when they're at higher level, because actually they're best viewed at eye level. When you view them sort of 3/4 side from the top, you tend to lose a bit of realism of what's going on. But you know, people seem to like them, so that's all that matters, I guess, really.
I think I heard somebody about to ask one question.
Yeah, a quick one, Julian. You talk about Type A, which tank cars, which I understand are for petrol. Is Type B, will diesel be carried in Type B, or was it heavy oil?
It could have been anything in terms of oil, depending on whose rail car it was. Your Type Bs tend to feature bottom discharge and heated discharge from the wagons. Right. And they'll have an element in there that keeps the whatever grade of oil is being carried fluid. So it can be drawn off using a pump system that's down at low level at the ground. The earlier tanks were all top discharge through that manhole lead arrangement on the top of the tank. And it's not uncommon to see ladders laid around where people scrambled up to the top to get to the catwalks where the tanks themselves didn't feature ladders. And then you dangled your hose in and more often than not emptied that vehicle using a hand pump, a rotary hand pump, which has 1/4 of a circle travel on it. Not uncommon for people in the fuel yards to have massive biceps on one arm, like Popeye, and to be absolutely covered in fuel all day long. Surprising, really, when you consider how common smoking was, that most of them didn't go up in flames.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Are you happy to carry on?
Yes, anytime you like. Yes. Stick this back up on the next slide, and This is a bit lighter and a bit shorter. Okay, let's go to the next one, please. Right, well, of London clay, why and how? Why? Well, in a sense, why not? When you first start out, when you're modeling in any scale, you start small, don't you? You build wagons, or you might do a building, or maybe two, before you move on to the larger, complicated pieces. And this gives you a small amount of stock that needs to be stored somewhere, or maybe even displayed somewhere if you want to refer back to it as you build on what you're doing and improve your skills. And haven't got enough wagons to fill a short siding. I think there were 3 to start with. I got hold of a large pile of hand-built track, which was coming off a layout that was going for scrap. That track would have been no use for building and running layout. To be honest, it's mostly scrap anyway, but you can bang it into a fixed diorama like this and it's perfectly acceptable. I don't really have room for a layout, or if I'm honest, that much interested in operating. I prefer to build. And so what started out as a siding developed into a siding with some buildings behind it, some scenic backing. And so if you take that logic forward, you end up with a diorama. And of London clay, well, how? Well, when you've got a series of dioramas that all follow a similar theme set in a similar time frame, it becomes quite easy to link these together with a thread. And so what do we mean when we say diorama? What does that word actually conjure up? What does it mean? Next slide, please, Jackie. Here we go. Look, here's some definitions from the Collins English Dictionary and Thesaurus. First one, diorama is a noun, a 3-dimensional scene in which models of figures are seen against a background. Well, yeah, okay. However, there are other definitions out there, slightly more comprehensive ones. I'm a member of the IPMS, the International Plastic Modelers Society, and their definition is one I prefer. A diorama is a combination of one or more models in a believable setting that tells a story, sets a mood, or creates a charged atmosphere. Now, that's important. And that's what I like to try and achieve. Occasionally, particularly with the IMS, you'll see the term vignette come up, a short, graceful literary essay or sketch. That's rather poetic. It's got an elegant ring to it, and sometimes it fits your smaller dioramas better, particularly in other scales. Next slide, please. Now, the IPMS go further with their definition when considering judging dioramas in competition. Now, I don't submit these for competition. I don't model for medals, but the IPMS are by far and away their largest output is military models, planes, armor, war scenes. So keep that in mind as we read these definitions. In addition to evaluating the diorama's individual elements, judges will consider the strength of the diorama's storyline or mood and the overall presentation of the diorama. These 3 factors are equally important. A diorama with superbly modeled components but a weak storyline and presentation is not as strong as a diorama with well-modeled components and strong story and presentation. Model components, groundwork, scenery, the basics of construction and finishing are of prime importance, not only with the model elements, but also with the terrain, roadwork, buildings, and accessories that set the scene of the diorama. These are given equal importance to the primary model components and consistency of workmanship. That will also be evaluated. Well-done vehicles may not overcome poorly done figures and mediocre groundwork. That comes directly from IPMS UA's Modeller's Guide to Contests. I've left some words out to get it on the slide. Next slide, please, Jackie. So what are they looking for? Well, presentation. A diorama base should comprise individual elements that combine to form a realistic and/or plausible setting for the primary model components. Each of the elements also should be believable in its own right and consistent with the action or mood being depicted. There's a word again, mood, look. The base should provide a focal point for the scene and fit or enhance the storyline or mood of the diorama. Dioramas with a well-defined focal point highlighting a simple story generally will have a stronger presentation than those attempting to portray an entire battlefield. Don't forget, these guys are largely military modelers, and it's not unusual to see an entire battlefield. Storyline, mood, atmosphere. This element is what separates a diorama from models merely set on a base. A simple derelict vehicle rusting away in a field can set a mood just as well as a complete recreation of the Battle of Waterloo. The story, mood, or atmosphere created by the diorama should be obvious. Should be obvious. The judges, or anybody really, shouldn't have to strain to see it, and neither should anyone seeing this exhibition. Stories can incorporate historical or even humorous aspects. Imagination and inventiveness in telling a story or setting a mood can lift the diorama above the ordinary. Now, I don't submit dioramas into competition, but I do think they're very good guidelines to work to. If you're going to do it, you might as well try and set yourself some standards and just try your best, really. And so these things resonate with me as being a set of suitable targets. Next slide, please, Jackie. So how do we do it? Well, all of the dioramas use a floating shelf like the one you can see pictured there. I use those as a baseboard. There are several reasons for it. These are cheap. They're light. Well, when you start, they're light. They're made of a box type construction in very thin timber, and they don't warp and they don't seem to twist either. And you can see from that picture that each of these has a wall fixing integral to the design. So if you were doing this and you just wanted to put some wagons on a siding, you could actually fix it to the wall. Now, these shelves come with a weight limit, which I've completely ignored. I've danced all over them. I've extended the size of the shelf, and that completely negates the bracket you can see here. And that's what I mean there when I say the fixing has become redundant, in my case, due to size and weight. But you can get these from anywhere, B&Q, Range, any DIY superstore will do you. There'll be something close to you, and they come in a range of colours and sizes. So next slide, please, Jackie. For construction, the shelves I use have got a factory finish on them, gloss, satin or matte in a range of colours to suit what I'm doing, whatever theme I'm there. Of London clay is in 1/43, and white is my chosen colour as a base. The base unit size, in my case, for this particular series of London clay is 800mm long, 250mm wide, and 50mm deep, depending on the manufacturer. But there is a range of sizes out there. So you could do this big, you could do it small, whatever you want to do. In order to give the opportunity for depth in the road or the yard surfacing, I use a tiling trim, bent to suit or cut to suit, anything between 6 and 12mm deep. And I fix that around the outer 3 edges. And as the design evolves, I might have to widen further back to get everything in or create the depth of perspective. Ideally, the overall width needs to stay at a maximum of 350mm, and that leads to a modular base size for each diorama. I screw the tiling trim down so it's fixed permanent and extends using 6mm plywood or MDF to prevent warping. I try and avoid excess weight because by now it's getting actually quite awkward to maneuver for size through domestic doorways and up and down ladders. And it can be heavy to lift, particularly if I use a bit of plaster in there, or polyfiller, for example. I also box these things up in their own cardboard box, and because of the fragility of those boxes, you don't want them too big, and you can only really handle one at a time for weight. Next slide, please, Jackie. And so the theory is, whilst each diorama is capable of standing alone as a display piece, the design is such, if you use a standard modular layout, it's possible to use 2 boards together to give a greater depth or a length to any given scene that you might want to portray on the day. This here, for example, is High Road out front with coal yard sat tight behind it. And this is no different when you think about it to the typical model railway layout using a number of baseboards to stage the overall effect. The boards are just smaller than the average baseboard. They're lighter and they're not permanently fixed together. Next slide, please, Jackie. Once again, High Road and Coal Yard over on the left, and then High Road paired with Dock Branch on the right. So you can see how this works. Not all of my boards, because occasionally you diverge, because all modelers do this. Not all of them can be used like this, but you can display a range of 4 or so with 2 interchangeable front road sections, allowing for sufficient variety and displaying any chosen vehicle with a different backdrop combination at any given time or period you wish to display. Next slide, please, Jackie. Now, here you can see how you might link the dioramas to give an overall consistent snapshot in time, a day in the life, if you like. You can use vehicles owned by the proprietors on one diorama, Huggins, Bayliss and Jones, look. Yeah, that's their AEC. Portray him crossing or passing through another diorama. Or you could do different periods if you want, by offering different vehicles of different eras and build dates. Example here, look, HBJ's Mammoth Major is arriving at Gateway 5, having gone through up the junction. The trailer on Gateway 5 on the right there is destined for collection by the AEC, dragging back to the factory we saw earlier. And this should start to become obvious. If you're looking at these on display and you're looking at 3 or 4 dioramas, I'll do this, I'll link them. It should be obvious to the viewer there's a story going on here. If it's not obvious, then I've failed. Most people get it when they come and look at them. I think modeling's really all about suspension of belief, even if it's for the very short time that people are looking at these things. And I think that's important. I think if you're going to model and people are going to come and look at it, then they should believe in what they're looking at. Next slide, please, Jackie. So once you've worked the design out and what you're going to do, you build these things in sort of sub-assemblies, and then layers of card and cork or foam board are stuck down using PVA to get the surfacing up to the required level. Various methods are used for creating the surfacing you're looking at there. It's mostly formed out of very fine grained cork, which is then grouted up with spare tiling grout and then painted, or printed card cutting tight around the buildings, little bits of clay work, anything that's laid about I use really. And here, look, you can see the example in the surfacing and the various types that are created on the old entrance down to Gateway 5. Next slide, please, Jackie. Now, here, this is talking about sub-assemblies, really. Lone Pit Lane West on the left. The box and its immediate surroundings are built as a sub-assembly and then dropped into the overall scene. And likewise on up the junction on the right, the shops are built as a sub-assembly, and so is the bridge. And then these units are brought together and linked up with the surfacing and surrounding area. And by doing that, you can see what I'm saying there. The build sequence treats each element as a scene as a sub-assembly of the overall picture, and it's important to keep that overall picture in your mind. I usually know where I'm going by the stage I've built a couple of 3 of these sub-assemblies, and that allows harmonization of the piece without too much intervention or change during the final act of completion. Well, I don't know that ever happens. I wrote that down and thought, that's not right, nothing's ever finished. But it's up to you when you call it finished, isn't it, really? And I make the point here as well that it's not unusual for me to get 2/3 of the way through one of these things and go off in a totally different direction, particularly if somebody's got something nice for sale in the second-hand market. Next slide, please, Jackie. Oh, no, this is a bit dull. Technique. Well, there aren't any, really. There are no special or difficult techniques used in the creation of these things. I use a computer, but then I work with a computer all day, every day. A lot of people don't like the idea of using computers. All I would say is persevere. It's worth it. Why not use the technology if you can? I'm not shy with doing it and don't see why I should suffer unduly. I don't use enamel paints anymore, very rarely anyway, the little tins. I mostly use acrylics from the military modelling sphere, from the likes of Miagamo, Viero, and others. Occasionally watercolours in paint or pencil bound form, that is tremendously useful. And then weathering powders from MIG, Abteilung 502 or even Humbrol, although I don't particularly like that. All those little packs that you can get from Tamiya, which are very good. You apply those with a makeup brush or a little swab, washes, pastels, and just plain pencils when I need to. I very rarely use an airbrush, although I've got 3 of the blasted things. They've all cost me a fortune over the years, and there is a compressor to go with them. Too much cleanup time for me, really, even when you're working with acrylics, which can be water-based, but usually you'll need a wetting agent. If I need to cover a large area, I'll use a rattle can or sorry to say, a larger brush. I mostly work in cards, both recycled serial and new stock, no doubt about that. Picture framing card is particularly good. I use wood quite a lot, occasionally plastic card. Styrene sheet is very good, and bits of brass for the finer stuff. When gluing, I like to stick to a form of PVA. I take it in different forms and will dilute where necessary, or Araldite Rapid if I need strength, longevity. Sometimes I use just something as simple as double-sided sticky tape, particularly if it's a large flat area and I'm bonding a brick paper down. Leads to holding your breath from time to time when you do it, but you know. Cyano, super glue. Well, yeah, super glue. I'm better at using it for the original purpose of sticking your fingers together than getting it where I want it. But I do have several types, including the thicker stuff, which gives you just a split second. And I need that an awful lot of the time. Next slide, please, Jackie. So suppliers, who do I use? Well, many different suppliers is the answer. Have been used in the creation of this modelling odyssey. Shouldn't that be oddity? It should be, really. But my absolute favourite here for road vehicles is Tony Heselden at 143rd Transport Models. Now, Tony's got an excellent range, first-class range of period lorries, buses and trams to choose from. They're 3D prints. They're now in a resin material. These are some of his earlier prints, and this is the wagon that features the right roping and sheeting, prototypical roping and sheeting, perhaps we should say. And in my view, these are the easiest kits to assemble out there on the market. And Tony would want me to tell you now with wheels included, which is extremely important. I have to say at this point, a real big thank you to Tony for just producing these vehicles. I'm so glad you did. Of London Clay would be just such a much poorer place without them. So thank you, Tony. Here's to many more. Huh? Next slide, please. Buildings, vehicles, sundries. I'm not proud I'll use anything from anybody. Offcuts from the local supermarket, absolutely anything. They're all listed there. And this is by no means all of the people I use. There's far too many to list them all, so I won't dwell, as it says here. But I would recommend that you go and have a look at the traders details section on the GOG website. That's just brilliant. And I will occasionally just wander off in there for an hour. And you'd be surprised what inspiration you can get just from finding something small, something new that has just come onto the market. That can lead all over the place, really. It costs you all kinds of money. But go and have a look. There's some really fantastic things out there, but you must spend some time looking to see what's available. Next slide, please, Jackie. Right, let's have some rules or some do's and don'ts. here you go. Number one, there are no fixed rules about what you do or how you do it, unless you do competitions. And that's up to you if you want to do that. Do have fun building something. Do make whatever you like. And do remember while you're doing it that the world will still keep turning no matter what color you've painted it. Don't worry about getting it right. And don't worry about what anyone else thinks. And whatever you do, don't drink the glue or the thinners, because it won't end well. And with that, next slide, please, Jackie. Any questions?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Had a couple of comments, Jackie. First one from can't get it. First one from Dr. Dave. Changing how the diorama develops mimics real life, where there is continual development. Early buildings get adapted for new use and extended modified life to suit. And Dave Howlett, I wonder if that's the Dave Howlett we all know. An excellent presentation, my early childhood relived.
Hello, Dave. Thank you very much.
I think it is.
Were you the butcher in the prefab?
It is certainly.
It is Dave. It is Dave. You know, love.
I think the thing for me is the again, the authenticity. As I said, you almost feel with the story and the images and it being set at a certain period and everything being so authentic to that period, as though you've just walked into the diorama. And I think, I know the plastic modelers are very, very keen to have certain standards for their competition. They're right about creating an atmosphere and having a mood as well, because you can feel that in your dioramas.
Well, they're a convenient source of the IPMS of rules. I don't actually believe you should follow any, but if you're going to try and do something, you might as well have something to shoot at, as it were. Yeah. When you look at what they do for competition, and interestingly, they do Scale Model World over at Telford, 3-day event, which used to be the week after the Guild Show, or a fortnight after. And they still do it over at Telford, 3-day show over there. The number of classes, you'd be astonished at just how many types of tank there are in the world, quite frankly. But there is a class for virtually anything. Exceptional talent on display, really good. Well worth a visit if anybody's going over that way.
Calvin Wright has said, do you make mock-ups when you're planning a diorama?
Mock-ups? Oh, all the time. Oh, mock-ups? No, I don't bother. I just do it as I go along. I'll have an idea of what I want when I start, and I'll sketch it. So all laid around the place, there are sketches of things that catch my attention at that given time, and I sort of bring those together in a folder and a combination of sketchbooks, and I sort of work away at that. And then it's quite interesting, actually, as you've built the diorama, when you get somewhere near the end of it, to get a sketch out and look at it and go, well, did that do what I wanted it to do? No, it didn't. Or yes, it did. Maybe. What can I do to it to take it off in a different direction? So I don't necessarily frame out a building for size, but what I do is work out the maximum modular size and then draw up on a piece of card what elements might go where, so that I understand how that will look and understand how the finished photographs or photographing of that diorama or vehicle on it might look. And I get that spectacularly wrong all the time. but it doesn't really matter.
And another
would say.
question, who was the Austin truck model in one of the earliest slides produced by?
Oh, the one alongside the derelict building on that is, or came from, it's a conversion. It was from goods yard models. You can still pick them up on the second-hand market from any of the second-hand die-cast suppliers. They retail now at about what they were originally, about 65, 70 quid. It's an open side, drop side truck. Mine's got a canvas back on it and is transferred up to be Stevenson the grocers. There were only 2 models available from that company. There was, I think it was a Fordson ET6 and the Austin, well, you could say K2 series. It's certainly a K or maybe a late M39. But you can still get them. They sold out very quickly. I was lucky enough to get mine at a show when they were first imported. I have had cause to go back and buy some more on the second-hand market because they're excellent for conversion into other things. The furniture van that you saw is a conversion on one, the Pantechnicon.
What sorts of prototype information do you use? It's a question from
Well, I
John.
get that. Well, now here's an opportunity for a plug. I come from a preservation background, and I spent a lot of my childhood in and around vehicles of this age at the East Anglia Transport Museum over in Carlton Colville, just outside Lowestoft. I thoroughly recommend a visit should you ever find yourself over that way. Entirely volunteer run, but you can ride on a tram, a trolley bus, a taxi. You might even get a lift on a push bike if it's the right day and the weather's nice. There's a narrow gauge railway there, fully functioning tramway. So I come from that background anyway. Beware the preservation market if you're trying to create something in an everyday working environment, because here, 70 years ago from the period that I'm, or 70 years forward from the period that I'm modelling, some of the preserved stuff that's out there features a lot of modern addition. But that's easy enough rectified if you know what you're looking for. And take yourself off to any one of the rallies you see around the country, any given weekend. Take a camera with you. And failing that, give us a shout and I can provide some pictures of various bits and pieces that you might need for putting these together. I mean, a word for Tony here. If you're picking up one of Tony's marvellous kits of British road vehicles, you'll need to do a bit of detailing, but they're so simple, brilliant, and easy done from photographs. And there's plenty of stuff out there on the internet of preserved vehicles. Unfortunately, you mostly get, as with railway vehicles, 3/4 front shots, when really you want to be laid under the back end of it. But I've got plenty of photographs of the back ends of wagons.
Tony Geary wants to know, are the buildings modelled from actual prototypes?
Only the small paraffin warehouse on Coal Yard is a replica of a building over here in town in York. Everything else is just entirely freelance. But again, there's a series of loose guidelines to follow when looking at any shop, and you can still see a lot of it if you walk down the high street today. Just look above the ground floor. Anything above the ground floor, above your top advertising board, is likely to be pretty much like it was way back when. And Burton stores are a good example of this. If you go into a town centre, you can spot the Co-op, Burton's, who else? Let me see. There's plenty around. And interestingly, the major cities, London itself, not so good, but you get out into the provinces and the major market towns still have a wonderful variety of shops and arcades and buildings that just cry out to be modelled. And I wander around with a phone that's got a fantastic camera on it, and I just take pictures all over the place all the time of things that interest me. Might not interest you right enough. I mean, you know, there's only so many pictures of downpipes you can take.
Dave Howlett's mentioned that you've clearly developed an extensive knowledge of the social history of the period, and as a
I wouldn't
child
say
of the late
extensive, Dave.
as a child of the late 40s, early 50s, I experienced the era in person. You may be a bit younger than me. What sources do you use to inform your historical knowledge?
Well, again, surprisingly, I have parents, and they remember it. The preservation sphere, particularly if you go back 20, 30 years, was populated with an awful lot of people who had lived through this period. And I was always fascinated to listen to it, to hear about it. Prefabs were still common then, and still are, actually. They're disguised an awful lot of the time, but people who've had prefabs and grown up within them were so loath to have them knocked down, because they represented a whole new start, a fresh start, a whole new way of life. And you can still find them in rows dotted around the country, as well as at several museum sites. And you can get to go in these things and experience exactly what they were getting. Can you imagine coming out of a bombed out slum terrace somewhere in the East End with no running water, outside WC, meat safe, no fridge. So to get bombed out of that actually might well have been something of a blessing in disguise, really. No good for a street scene, though.
You made it sound just like home.
Oh, well, there you are, Dave. I left the soundtrack of the violins off.
How do you manage perspective, Julian? Because in your dioramas, the depth of field is so accurate, and yet when you're modeling a layout, trying to get that sort of looking down a street, buildings either side, takes a lot of skills. How do you manage?
Well, how do I manage that? Do you know what, Jackie? I don't. The answer is take 500 photographs and use 5. That's how you do that. I've yet to master Sky. Let's call it Sky. Ultimate background. And the way I think I do that, there's a couple of guys that do this online who would take their model and take it, in some cases, to the area that they've actually modeled. But the trick is in photographing it with a completely clear field of view in the background. Now, because I've done a lot of my stuff indoors, I've had to use makeshift backgrounds, just black cloth or white cloth or whatever, or bits of card propped up, just to give me a neutral, plain background behind some of the buildings. And sometimes when you look, you can see that plain as day. But fortunately, because you only get to see them for a fleeting moment in real terms, you don't notice. Now, occasionally I can doctor an image, and you can do it. There's software available out there where photo stacking, for example, you can take a picture. That software will take that picture and redo it 7,500 times and then layer it on top so that everything is in focus, right from the far background right up to the stuff at the front. It's quite expensive. I don't use it. I just take lots of different pictures and then pick the one I think works well. But for every one that works well, like I say, 150 that don't. But it's digital photography. You're not spending any money on film, just delete the ones you don't want. No other mystery than that. And I'll tell you something else as well. I take my best photos on my phone, despite having 2 stupidly expensive cameras that neither me or my daughter can use. Life, isn't it?
Your phone's always in your pocket as well. Your big camera's not.
Yeah, always.
Yeah,
always. And it, you know, occasionally you'll show people things at a club meet or whatever you're doing on your phone, and they always with me say, "Why have you got all those pictures of those sides of houses? What's that thing holding that building up? Why is there what paving flags? What's that all about?" I just wander around taking pictures like that all the time.
Any other questions from anybody?
Nothing that I can see, Jackie.
No? Well,
Excellent.
while people are thinking about if they've got anything else, I'll just run through what we've got coming up next month. So if I just share screen again.
You.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much to you for a very interesting evening. I think you've captured all of us. I know from my background, which was dolls' houses and building rooms and doing everything very authentically to show the scene of a building in a certain period, I can see the whole relationship, and it makes me realise how I got into model railways as well and taking the building aspect across. So thank you very, very much, Julian. For
Thank you.
everybody else, next month, which is the last one for the year, we've got an evening with John Buck. John Buck's Railway, Hope Street, is featuring in our virtual show on the 5th of November. And he will then follow that up with an evening with at the end of November on Saturday the 26th to talk about how he built the buildings and made them so authentic on Hope Street. So you get a sort of double whammy. You can see the railway in the virtual show. We'll then release that video for everybody who's attending the evening with on the 26th of November. So if you missed the virtual show and you haven't had time to watch the video, you'll get it sent to you as a link, and you'll be able to talk to John and see how he did the buildings on Hope Street. And Tony Cowell's going to be hosting that evening for me. The virtual show we've just mentioned, it's on the 5th of November. It's an annual event now and much loved by people across the world because it gives you the day to enjoy it live, and you can literally go to the main front page of the website. There'll be a countdown for the last sort of few days and then the last 24 hours, and then the doors will open and you just literally click to go into the show. And it's laid out as usual with an area with layouts, and I think Tony, you said we've now got 17 layouts, is that correct? Tony's maybe unmuted, or but I'm sure he said to me just before we started that we've now got videos of 17 layouts, and several of the layout owners have them in gardens or sheds or in bedrooms, so you won't get to see these at an exhibition. And that's the beauty of the virtual show. People from all over the world can send us a video of their layout and we get to enjoy it even if it can't come out to exhibitions. So some of them will also be doing live question and answer. Sorry, was somebody speaking there? No. There's also some videos of demonstrations, how to fit a DCC chip, weathering, painting and lining, and there are some live demonstrations as well, which will be going on all day, and you can literally go into those. Quite a lot of our traders will be doing adverts. Many of them will point you to their website because obviously their website contains a wealth of information. And we've also got some opportunities to do meet the conreps. We've got 2 sessions for that, and we've also got meet the chairman and meet the president, because we have a new president in Martin Long, and Charles Oldroyd has agreed to stay on as chairman for the forthcoming year. So there's opportunities to chat to them and tell them what you would like to get from the Gauge Guild going forward. I know we've got some non-members, but also you've probably all got colleagues in clubs and friends who may not be members of the guild. We do an awful lot now. We have obviously the gazettes and guild news for people, which are the quarterly magazines and newsletters. We've got a massive website with a wealth of information, 3 shows a year, plus the virtual show, plus these seminars every month, a huge YouTube channel and gallery, and lots of forums to talk about modelling topics. So if you know anybody who wants to just try out the guild, they can join for a month free of charge, explore everything online, and then decide if they would like to become a member. And if they do want to find out a bit more about it, then the website, if you click on About Us on the front page, you scroll down through the drop-down menu, join online, and at the bottom of that, you can select 1 month free trial. As I've mentioned, we've got lots more evening with sessions booked for next year. We've also got our shows already booked and lined up for next year. So Saturday, the 4th of March, we're back at Kettering for the spring show. Looking forward to our new venue for the summer show in Barnsley. And then Guild-X again in Stafford on the 2nd and 3rd of September. And there's always so many layouts, trade stands, demonstrations, test tracks, workshops, society stands for people. We hope very much that it displays the very biggest and best of 7mm modelling. And we are still hoping to have our Southern show in 2023 as well. We're trying to finalise when we can fit that into the calendar. So we might have 4 shows next year. So thank you all very much for joining us. The evenings can't happen without all of you. See you again on the, that should say Saturday, the 26th of November, and it should say GMT. So that's my error for not updating my slide properly. So it's Saturday, the 26th of November, and obviously the clocks will have changed. So we're back on Greenwich Mean Time. So apologies for that. Check your slides.
It was very good, Jackie. Listening to a man that models the same era that I model.
Yes.
To be in the late 40s, to get all the grime, muck and everything else. To me, that was wonderful.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Glad you enjoyed that, John.
I did. I really enjoyed it. Right up my street. Right down to the threshing engine and elevators.
There's certainly lots of lovely comments coming in as well, Julian. So lots of people saying what a great evening it's been. Thanks for an informative session. Many thanks. Thank you, Julian, for a brilliant trip down memory lane. And I think, you know, it's been an amazing opportunity to see your dioramas and know how you put them together, and wonderful stories behind them. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Julian. Great, mate.
Thank you very much. And thanks for the recommendation, Richard.
My pleasure. Pleased it's been a success.
Very good.
Bye now.
And somebody who also remembers the plank on the barber's seat. That's Tony Geary.
Yeah.
So yes,
Yeah.
very, very nice.
I remember that.
Always good to go and get your ears lowered, particularly by some sort of maniac wielding a throat razor, sitting in a leather chair. I could never be sure about the smell of the alcohol, you know, but hey ho.
Excellent.
Okay, thanks,
Thank you very
guys.
much. And
Bye now.
see you all next month. Thank you.